I just note, just very briefly, that at least, unless I'm wrong, the United States does not accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ, and so it's interesting that Mary Ellen keeps coming back to an authority that is not, in fact, recognized as binding by the government of this country.
Ben, I'm sorry, I have to correct that. The United States is a party to the statute of the International Court of Justice. We have recognized its compulsory jurisdiction in many, many treaties. It still has compulsory jurisdiction in many treaties to which we are a party. We do recognize the authority of the court. We've just sent a person of great respect in the State Department, Joan Donahue, to be a judge of the International Court of Justice. So it is simply not the position of the United States not to respect the authority and the competence of the International Court of Justice. We've lost some cases, which we did not make strong arguments in, which we were not in a good position to win. And you do hear a lot of criticism of the court, but in every litigation I've been involved in, the party that lost likes to complain about the court.
That's really a different panel with that, sorry.
Two quick questions. One, you mentioned that to the extent that you have cooperation with the territorial government, then you support it is lawful. And this isn't an official account, but according to Wittes' recent book, there is quite a high level of cooperation with the Pakistani government. And in his account, at the very least, the drone attacks have been authorized at high levels of the Pakistani government, which has distinguished between that and intervention by special forces, which they haven't agreed to. And there's an ongoing negotiation over that. So do you think, assuming that that's true, do you think then that solves the case, and that would solve the case also for the Yemenese government? And the question is, what level of, how public does the cooperation have to be? Because it could be problematic for the host government to sort of publicly embrace it while they actually agree with this. And then just to extend your analogy to liability for the legal advisor or the president, do you think congressmen would have liability for financing some of these programs? Because there are appropriations bills that are used for these programs. So to the extent that you hold the legal advisor and the administration liable, would you also have to hold the legislature liable?
Well, so that's a very interesting question, actually. Just to be clear, I posed the question rhetorically by way of highlighting what I think is the radicalism of Mary Ellen's position, which she will not state. And it's interesting to me that she comes back to, she finally, after a very long response to my question, was willing to settle on the words unlawful killing, but will not speak the words murder or serial killing, which is really what she's describing. Yes, if I thought that's what was going on, I would have to say the conspiracy in the U.S. government is extremely broad. It's after all, these programs are specifically appropriated. The congressional, both congressional intelligence committees have been extensively briefed on. Interestingly, you haven't heard a peep of protest from members of the intelligence committees about these programs. And so I think if you really take seriously the idea that these are, extrajudicial killings / murders, and the numbers that she cites are astonishing. I mean, we think of a serial killer as pretty prolific when you're talking about 10, 20. I mean, you're talking about 1,000 people, right? And you're talking about buy-in, extraordinary buy-in from Congress. And so I would think that you would have, if Mary Ellen's theory is correct, you have a very broad-based problem of people knowingly contributing to activity that she describes as unlawful killing, and in her writing makes clear are prosecutable.
And then in your next op-ed, you have to give attribution to the financing.
Yes, it's interesting that I'm being called the radical, although I keep putting forward statements of what the law requires, trying to get us into compliance with the law, which I always thought was the conservatives' position. So,
well, I've certainly never held myself out as a conservative. So.
Well. Yes. My whole career and my purpose in life is to promote the rule of law in the world, and I consider that to be a quite conservative position, so I'll take the label conservative. Why do I not say murder? This is a term that is used for criminal prosecution, persons who have had a chance to have a trial to make their defense and so forth. I don't throw that term around lightly. I do want to see the United States get into compliance after the tragic years in which we were using torture in this country and there were no prosecutions. I don't hold out hope that there will be prosecutions for extrajudicial killing. My more immediate concern and purpose, where I hope all of us who will leave this room more committed to act, is to stop future killing. We know that many countries have had their leadership commit very serious violations of international law with no accountability. The human rights community, international law community is committed to trying to change that, but we've had a setback over these last years, and I don't expect it to happen. So I don't see any real purpose in arguing about those matters. I'm interested in going forward and getting our country into compliance with international law. And we can talk about accountability later. I'd like to now answer the very good question put with regard to Pakistan. Pakistan is a very complicated situation. We carried out, it looks like it's going to be something in the order of 200 strikes there by the end of this year. Those strikes are occurring in a variety of situations, some of which are defensible, some not. Some of the strikes have plainly been part of Pakistan's own armed conflict hostilities in Pakistan against insurgents who are opposing who are organized armed groups posing a real armed conflict threat or forces of certainly in Buner province when there was an actual attempt to take over sovereignty of that province. It was certainly, in my view, lawful for the Pakistani armed forces to push back. And if we coordinated a drone strike with Pakistan in those operations, the act itself, this is another question about who in the U.S. was carrying out the act, but the act itself is justifiable under the law of armed conflict. So there are, in my view, there are surely some drone attacks in Pakistan which are justifiable. But other places where the U.S. has carried out drone attacks, but Pakistan itself has not been engaged in armed conflict, even with Pakistan's consent, I have serious questions under human rights law whether we could do that, whether they had the consent to do that. And that would be my point with regard to Yemen, where we are involved in no Yemeni armed conflict. So even if Yemen says to us, you can carry out your drone strike, or more recently in May we carried out a cruise missile attack from a fighter jet, that even if we had consent to do that, because it's not part of armed conflict hostilities that are going on in Yemen's territory, there's no lawful basis for doing that. And then, of course, there's the third category, which is occurring mostly in Pakistan, where Pakistan plainly has not given us any kind of consent. And this is with regard to the al-Haqqani network. Al-Haqqani is generally supportive of Zardari, and he has not wanted us to go after al-Haqqani, and those are the most questionable of all. But so we have to be good lawyers in these cases, very precise, and make it clear where not the U.S. is acting lawfully.
I'd just like to address that very, very briefly. I think it is a very dubious undertaking to sit here without access to classified information and purport to know what level of consent we have from what governments to do what on their territory. I don't purport to know that, and I don't know where Mary Ellen purports to know that from, but I would just treat with a lot of skepticism the idea that there is major, ongoing, over a number of years, military action taking place on Pakistani soil by U.S. forces without some significant degree of cooperation and consent. And indeed, there has been a lot of press reporting to the effect that a lot of the targeting information is being fed us by Pakistani forces.
Just one point in defense of my reputation. I'm a specialist in the law of armed conflict and in the definition of what armed conflict is. We can look at the facts in countries such as Pakistan and Yemen, very open public sources, and understand what situations are and whether they are places where the U.S. can use armed conflict level military force or not.
Let's take two more. First one, top row. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I'm a foreign lawyer and not a US lawyer, and I want to give a foreign lawyer's perspective specifically on the question if a CIA officer kills under the authority of the president, is that an unlawful killing? And I think it's very important to distinguish between what the foreign affairs powers of the president are under the US Constitution and what international law says. And I'm very sorry to say this, and I don't think it's going to go down well in this room, but the US Constitution is for people who are non-US citizens one of the constitutions in the world. And it's a very, very well-written constitution. It's an extremely influential constitution, but that these qualities do not give the US more authority, legal authority on the international legal field to do as it pleases, even if there are very good policy arguments in favor for that position. So I think the question whether, I mean, the issue is not whether the US Constitution gives the president these powers. The question is whether international law allows that. And I think Mary O'Connell gave a very conclusive argument for that. On international law, it's a violation to kill on such a basis. And whether the US president or the CIA officer who commits these killings is liable, that's a question of international criminal law. But I think
you quickly wrap it into a question.
The last conclusion is the US is violating international law no matter what the Constitution says.
Anyone want to derive a question from that?
Well, I would just say that no part of my argument has depended on the constitutional authority of the president, so I'm not really sure that. My only point about the president's authority is that when you describe what the CIA is doing as crimes, as Mary Ellen has, it is important to note that the CIA officers who committed those crimes, if you call them that, are acting at the direct behest of the President of the United States. And therefore, those crimes cannot simply be described as the actions of individual CIA officers. It has to be imputed to the President. That's not an argument that is therefore lawful. It's simply an argument that that Mary Ellen's point is much more dramatic than simply that a few CIA officers are guilty of unlawful behavior.
For persistence.
Thank you so much. This is my 7th year attending this conference. I've never seen a panel like this. This sort of dropping the other person's name and making personal attacks is really unfortunate because I, like many of you, came here looking for a rigorous, analytic, intellectual discussion. And I don't know who's responsible for the selecting panelists or the way this went. Mary Ellen, I've seen you speak before. I've read your books. I think you're wonderful. But to engage in this kind of back and forth is really unfortunate.
You know, I think, let me find that. There's somewhere between, this again, remember, you probably know what I'm talking about. With Neil there report, it was a solid, quiet discussion among serious people on all sides of the spectrum, maybe on PBS and there's somewhere between that and MSNBC and Fox News. And that was the tone we were trying to strike. I think we pretty much hit that. I'm pretty happy.
This is not a because this was a common topic of question.
Series.
Can I have
The best panel of all 3 days.
Appreciate
Can I
that.
have a question?